Welcome back to the Leadership Lab. I'm Evan McGugan, former naval officer with over a decade of leadership experience in special operations. I hold an MBA and a master's in psychology and leadership from Penn State, and I advise executives, elite coaches, tradesmen, athletes, and working professionals on how to lead and influence effectively. This podcast is where I take that mix of academic research and pressure tested experience and I translate it into practical lessons that you can use to actually lead, motivate, and win. Now, you're going to want to watch today's video because it's about influence. And influence is the currency of leadership. And if you can't influence up, down, and across your organization, then you can't move your team, can't secure resources, and you can't create meaningful change. So let's get into today's topic. Here's a question for you. When men and women try to influence their boss, do they actually play by the same rules? Most people would say yes, but with one twist. Men are supposed to be directive and competitive, while women are supposed to be relational and collaborative. That's the stereotype. So here's the surprise. In a Fortune 100 company study, women were often more forceful than men when they thought that they were right. They pressed harder and they even pushed back against their boss, while men were more likely to compromise compared to their female counterparts. That flips the script, doesn't it? Today, we're unpacking this study, the dynamics of upward influence, how male and female managers get their way, published in the Leadership Quarterly. I'll break it down stage by stage. I'll explain the differences, and most importantly, I'm going to show how you use the lessons in your own leadership. First, let's look at how this study was done. They interviewed and surveyed 21 middle managers, 10 men and 11 women from a single Fortune 100 company that they did not name. And to keep it clean, they matched participants by rank, years of experience, and even how long they'd worked with their boss. They tracked influence attempts across 5 different stages. The first stage is motivation for action. So they asked why someone stepped up. Was it for themselves or was it for the team? The second stage is taking action. And they asked, did they speak up or did they stay quiet? The third stage is planning. So they asked whether the individual prepared alone or prepared with others. Now, the fourth stage is implementation. So they asked how the individual delivered their influence strategy. Was it direct? Was it indirect? Was it task focused? Or was it relational focused? And the fifth and final stage that the authors used in the study was evaluation. So they asked the individuals, how did they judge whether or not their influence attempt worked? So think of this like a 5-act movie. And at almost every stage of this study and every stage of this framework, men and women played their roles differently. Before we dive into each stage, let's pause for a second and talk about the theory behind this study. I know it's boring, but it provides some important context on how you can think about this topic. So this study leaned on an individual by the name of Nancy Chodorow and her theory of gender formation. Now, in simple terms, the theory holds that girls tend to form identity through connection, so relationships, empathy, and being in tune with others, whereas boys tend to form identity through separation or standing out, being independent, and being their own person. So that's the nurture side of the equation, and that's the theory that this study leaned on. I also want to present the other side of the equation that we can't ignore, which is nature. So from an evolutionary lens, men often developed more direct and competitive styles for competing because the resources and the status acquired through that competition usually paid off, whereas tended to develop a more relationship focused style because in our more ancestral times where survival was a lot harder, it depended on their ability to cooperate and navigate networks. Now, both matter, nature and nurture, but when we grow up and we step into management roles and we step into leadership roles, those early patterns, whether it be from nature or nurture or both, still shape how men and women attempt to persuade others. So that's the theory. And the study set out to test whether it showed up in real workplace influence attempts. And big surprise, it did. Now that we know the framework, let's walk through each stage of influence and see exactly how men and women differ. Now, stage one is motivation for action. In this stage, asks the question, when a chance to influence comes up, what made managers decide to act? And why did they step up in the first place? Now, what the study found was that men were much more likely to say that they acted out of self interest. Maybe it helped their career, maybe it helped their visibility in the company, or maybe it helped their reputation amongst their peers or their subordinates or their superiors, whatever it was. They would think something like, this will make me look good to others. Women, on the other hand, were much more likely to say they acted out of some sort of organizational interest. What was best for the company or the team or the customers, something to that effect. And they tended to think something like, this project is vital for the customers and we need to pursue it and we need to protect it. So that's what sparks action. But what happens once managers actually decide to step forward or hold back? That question is what brings us to stage two, which is actually taking action. So once a manager notices an opportunity for influence, they have to decide essentially to step up or stay quiet. So here's where the two huge things stood out between men and women, and that was how they considered empathy and risk. In terms of empathy, women were much more likely to consider the feelings of others before they acted, whereas men were much more likely to focus on only the issue itself. Now, risk consideration was different too. Women tended to worry much more about interpersonal risk, so hurting relationships or creating some sort of fallout with their subordinates. Whereas men, on the other hand, were much more worried about personal risk, so their own career, their own reputation. An example of this is, a female manager might hesitate to step up or to speak out because she's worried about the pushback that her boss might be angry with her team. Whereas a male manager or a male leader might hesitate to step up or take action because he's worried it could hurt his next promotion. Once a manager decides to act, the next step is figuring out how to prepare to initiate that influence attempt. And here's where planning styles between men and women show another really big split. Women were much more likely to involve others in their planning process. So they asked coworkers for input, they sounded out ideas, and they even rehearsed their influence attempt together. Whereas men were much more simple, and we were much more likely to plan alone and go at it alone. So an example, picture a woman manager or a female manager sketching out her pitch with her team on a whiteboard. Now, on the other hand, picture a male manager sitting at their desk writing their notes solo. It's essentially what it showed. Now, neither approach is wrong necessarily, but I do think it's important to understand the trade-offs. So the value that the common female approach that this study found involves others and creates buy-in and creates confidence in your approach, but it can take time. While planning alone can feel or actually be faster and is much more private and requires much less input from stakeholders. After planning comes the moment of truth, actually making the influence attempt. And at this stage of the study, there was another big reveal with how men and women actually tried to influence their boss. So at first, the stereotypes seemed to hold up. Men were much more direct and they would say, here's what we need to do, boss. Whereas women were much more indirect and they would hint and they would suggest and they would soften their message so it was received easier. Here's the interesting twist. When women really believed that they were right, they actually pushed harder than men when their bosses pushed back. Women often kept pressing the issue and they would even openly oppose their boss, whereas men were much more likely to compromise and bargain and settle. Why? Well, the authors proposed that because women had usually involved others earlier in their planning process, they felt a stronger sense of moral duty and they weren't just fighting for themselves. They felt that they were fighting for the organization or the team or their customer, whereas men who often planned alone didn't always have that same backing from the team and that same level of conviction. So here's an example from the study. A female manager kept pressing her boss to promote someone she knew was talented. She pointed out examples, she gave data, she pushed back, and then she eventually won her case. Whereas a male manager in this study who was in a similar spot described reaching a consensus and moving on much earlier, even though he didn't fully win his case. So, what the study found was that women weren't actually softer when it comes to implementing their influence attempt. They were often tougher, even if they moved slower and they used more subtle tactics earlier on in the process. Once the influence attempt has been made and the dust settles, every leader then has to ask themselves, was the attempt worth it? This takes us to the fifth and final stage of the framework, which is the evaluation part. So, how did the leaders and managers in this study judge the success of their influence attempt? Well, men judged it mainly by the outcome. They would essentially ask themselves, did I get what I want? And if I didn't fully get what I want, then to what degree did I get what I want? Women, on the other hand, judged it by both the outcome and the relationship that was left afterwards. So they would essentially ask themselves, did we get the result that we were after? And is my boss, my team, my customer, my peers still happy with me? Here's an example from the study. A male manager said he felt successful because the ratings of the product that he endorsed matched, whereas a female manager said she felt successful, but she also worried that her boss might be disappointed in her personally. So this dual focus, task plus relation, shaped how women saw their influence attempt and their influence strategy overall. Looking across all 5 stages of this framework, the researchers uncovered one finding that I think turns conventional wisdom upside down, perhaps the most out of anything else they found in this study. So we started with the stereotype that essentially holds that women are softer and men are tougher when it comes to their influence attempts. But this study showed that the opposite is true when it comes to pushing for what matters. So, in other words, conviction actually seems to be what matters the most when it comes to implementing an influence attempt. Women kept pressing because they believed that they were doing the right thing for the company or for their team or for their subordinates or for whomever. That conviction gave them energy and gave them confidence to stand their ground whenever they got pushback. Whereas men who tended to act more independently and plan more independently were much more willing to bargain. And without a network and a team of stakeholders behind them, it seems like our typical male strategy of go it alone doesn't necessarily give us the same level of conviction that we would like to believe it does. So, the big lesson about how men and women tend to influence is that forcefulness doesn't necessarily come from ego, although it can in some cases, but it almost seems to come mostly from involvement and ownership and collective buy-in. So if you built support around an idea, you believe you're doing the right thing, which women seem to have a higher preference for based on this study, then it seems like you're much more likely to stand your ground. So if the stereotypes around how men and women influence their superiors don't hold up to real world practice, then what does this study mean for us leaders today? Well, that's where the important implications of this study come in. The first implication is that neither style is better. Both can work really well, but the context matters a lot. So, in organizations where bosses value independence and toughness, maybe in a sales position, the male style of direct and independent planning and implementation may be rewarded more. But in a team based or a lot of modern organizations, females' preferred style of collaboration and relationship focused planning may actually fit better. So here's the challenge: leaders who only use one style limit themselves, So the best leaders are going to be the ones that are able to blend elements of both. They can use independence and speed and self assertion where they need to. And they can also use involvement and collaboration when it builds strength and collective buy in and personal conviction in what you're after. So think of these two styles like two different tools in your toolbox. You don't need to choose between one or the other, they're not mutually exclusive, but you do need to know which one to use and when. Make it even more practical for you. Let's flip the findings of this study into lessons men and women can learn from the other when it comes to preferred influence strategies. So, men can learn from women when it comes to involving others in the planning process early because allies give you conviction, they give you backup. Men can also learn from women when it comes to balancing the tension between tasks and relationships. So, goal achievements certainly build credibility, can't argue against that. But long-term influence also depends on trust. So you want to make sure that the way that you implement your strategy doesn't burn down bridges on your way through. Men can also learn from women when it comes to judging the success of their influence strategy by both the results and the relationship. Here's where women can learn from men when it comes to their influence tactics. Women can learn from men when it comes to using directness because it saves time and sometimes speed and clarity beat caution. Women can learn from men when it comes to not overthinking interpersonal risk because conflict handled well after the fact can also build respect too. And women can also learn from men when it comes to compromising when it sets you up for bigger wins later. So the bottom line is this: the best leaders know to borrow from multiple playbooks. All right, now let's take this theory and put it into practice for you. Here's a 5-step framework you can use right away for your next influence attempt. First step, define your motive. Are you oriented towards self-interest or organizational interest? Second step is identifying the risk. So is it personal risk or is it relational risk? The third step, deciding whether to plan alone or involve others and to what degree of either you're going to use. The fourth step is choosing your influence style. Are you going to be direct? Are you going to be indirect? Are you going to be forceful? Or are you going to be relational? And the fifth and final step is judging your success on both the results and the relationships that are left standing after you've made your influence attempt. So the thought exercise is basically this: take your last influence attempt, map it across these 5 steps, and identify where you lean more into the male style based on this study's characterization of influence tactics, and identify where you lean more into the female style based on this study's characterization of influence tactics, and identify what you could change the next time. Pretty simple. So with all that in mind, let's bring this video home and close with a few key takeaways. This study showed us a few things. First was that women tend to act for the organization more so than men when it comes to building their influence strategy, as opposed to just themselves. They are much more likely to consider others' feelings, involve others in the planning process, and have a much higher preference for balancing tasks with relationships. Also, when women believe that they're right, they can also be more forceful than men when it comes to reacting to pushback from their superior. Men, on the other hand, often act much faster. They often act much more independently. They plan alone. They focus almost exclusively on the task. And they also compromise more quickly whenever they get pushback. So the key lesson from this study is this: gender and preferred influence strategies are not a straitjacket when it comes to leadership and management. It may determine your preference based on your gender, but ultimately it's about choices and it's about context. And the best leaders are going to be ones that know how to borrow from a variety of strategies. Now, if you found this breakdown useful, download the free worksheet that's going to be in the description. Join the Leadership Lab community on School, where you can discuss and practice tools like this with myself and other peers that are passionate about their leadership journey. And then subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into leadership science, because leadership isn't about position, it's about influence. And the more you understand it, the more effective you'll be at wielding it. Thanks for tuning into the Leadership Lab.